So just a warning, this video is going to be a long and chatty one. So I highly suggest that you find some laundry to do or go for a walk and something where you can just listen, because there won't be much to see here. I'm also going to be referring to my notes a lot just to help me stay focused. So if I seem like I'm not focused on the camera, I'm looking down just trying to make sure that I'm staying on track and not rabbit trailing even more than necessary. If you're new to my channel, my name is Erica, and I've been playing around here on YouTube for the last 2 to 3 months or so, and lately it's just been really on my mind that the videos that I posted, or the majority of them anyways, have very little spiritual significance, very little worth in light of eternity, and so it's just been really on my mind to share a bit more of my story and share with you just the journey that the Lord has taken me on to get me here. So to answer the question where I am from Alberta, Canada. I grew up in a little Mennonite town in northern Alberta, and I was born 3 months early. So the Lord's intervention in my life started pretty early, with literally just sparing my life. My parents were fortunate enough to be able to be in touch with a team of doctors who looked at my parents' situation and said, that baby has a 50-50 chance and we are willing to take it. And the Lord blessed that. The Lord blessed their efforts, but He definitely also stretched the limits of what they were able to do at the time. I was a very sick little baby, hence some of the scarring that I've referred to on my abdomen, and I have other scars other places as well from a lot of the measures that they had to take to spare my life. And there came a point where the doctors called my parents up and said, you know, there's just nothing more we can do. She's very sick. You need to come right now. For those who aren't familiar with the either Canadian healthcare system or the geography of Canada, when I say northern Alberta, I mean like my parents lived multiple hours away from this particular children's hospital where I was staying. And so it was a good half a day's drive or so to get there. And my mom had gone home to be with my older brother for just basically a period of time, some respite, as I had been in the hospital for a number of very long weeks at this point. And she made it back to the hospital. I was still alive at that point, but they, clearly, but they, I think at that point, were unsure if I would make it through the night. And so my mom has shared this story with me since then of how, you know, she says up until this point, she had just been willing me to live. Like she was somehow, of her own will, I was going to live. I was going to make it. I was going to survive. And she said that night in particular, she realized that she couldn't hang on anymore. She came to a point where she just couldn't hold on to me like that anymore. And so she realized that she had to give me up to the Lord, and it was going to be up to Him whether I made it or not. And God intervened. He spared my life that night, and I continued to pull through and get stronger. And the doctors really have no explanation for that. They had reached the limits of what they could do, and it was truly a miracle that I made it through that time. And so I like to refer to that as the first time that the Lord saved my life, because I definitely think He had done it multiple times in multiple ways. And so to put a little context to, again, my family and where I grew up, I am the second oldest of 4 children. My brother and I are both biological, and my 2 younger siblings were adopted a bit later on in our lives. And I grew up in the country, like I said, in a small Mennonite community in northern Alberta. attending a just evangelical Mennonite church every Sunday and Wednesday, and attending a small rural school close by. With attending that church, my mom says that at a very young age, we think about maybe 5 or 6, I came home from attending a children's session at a missions conference one night and just insisted that I wanted to pray the prayer that they had shown us in the back of this little book. I wanted to repent of my sins and accept Jesus into my heart. Whatever comprehension you can have of that at such a young age, I insisted that's what I wanted to do. And so my mom prayed with me, and that's really all I know or remember of the whole situation. And so fast forward a few years from that point in time, and I have more vivid memories of my childhood, particularly the point at which my mom needed a kidney transplant. That whole ordeal, I was about 8 years old. For whatever reason, that whole ordeal ended up being a bit traumatic for me. She was very upset going into surgery. I remember that much. And something went wrong during surgery. Things were taking longer. I didn't know. I mean, I was still not very old, but I just remember sitting in the waiting room with my dad and him anxiously looking at the clock and just recognizing that something wasn't right. Something was taking too long. And after she came out of surgery, came out of recovery, we found out that something did in fact go wrong, even though the doctors weren't willing to admit it. She had started bleeding out with a procedure that they needed to do after the surgery took place while she was in the recovery room. And so that was very hard for me to hear. I was old enough to understand that something very bad had just been narrowly avoided. And I became very scared. I became very scared of death. What I didn't realize had happened with that fear of death was that I had ultimately opened a door to demonic oppression. I wouldn't come to recognize this until over 10 years later, but that is what happened. So I eventually just became very depressed. I was very frustrated. I remember being very frustrated and anxious, I guess, during the time that my mom was recovering from that surgery. I was living in the city with her, away from my dad and my brothers. They stayed home so that my dad could continue working. Without knowing what was happening, I was getting hit with thoughts from demons. I vaguely remember trying to explain to my mom that I was having quote-unquote thoughts that weren't my own. I didn't know how else to explain it or describe it. I was too young, and something seemed very off. I didn't know what it was, but I recognized that these thoughts weren't mine. And unfortunately, this is no fault of my parents, but unfortunately my mom was not able to help me. They weren't familiar enough with spiritual warfare at the time to understand what was going on. And so all I really remember after that is eventually I began to take on those thoughts as my own. Whether they were thoughts that I was worthless or that I should even, eventually it would go so far as to I should take my life. And so fast forward a bit to my early teens. As any teen or preteen knows, you go through a lot of change during this time. And so we're talking the whole 9 yards, getting glasses, getting braces, going through puberty, the awkwardness of learning to be your own individual. It didn't help that I was a very introverted person and had struggled, basically ended up struggling all throughout my public school years with making friends and maintaining good, healthy friendships. So in place of that, I turned a lot to entertainment, just different forms of entertainment, whether that was books or music, or eventually TV shows. And what I was watching in particular became more and more either violent or sexual in nature. And I mean, I wasn't watching R-rated movies every weekend. We're just talking soap operas, dramas that you can see on television. I was watching stuff that I knew I shouldn't be allowing into my mind, stuff that my parents would not be pleased with, and stuff that I knew God would not be pleased with. And so in light of that, I struggled with a lot of guilt. To top that off, I have always had a hard time sleeping. I've struggled with insomnia on and off my entire life. And so I developed this tactic, I guess you could say, of letting myself sink into these very dark thoughts and this guilt, and I would cry myself to sleep. Often begging God to forgive me, and then the next day I would turn around and I would go right back to my old ways of looking for garbage entertainment. So during this time I had no assurance of salvation, and if I had done what these demons wanted me to, what these voices that were still speaking into my mind wanted me to do, and commit suicide, I don't believe I would have gone to heaven. I was failing miserably to understand the entirety of the gospel and had no way of grasping anything beyond justification. I don't really know how else to explain that, but that is just what was going on in my mind. So this behavior of being introverted and turning to TV or movies or music, books, what have you, searching the internet till all hours of the night, finding TV shows illegally if I wasn't able to binge watch them the way I wanted to on satellite television. All of that behavior continued, and from about the age of 9 or so till roughly 14 years of age. When I was somewhere around the age of 13 or 14, I went to a youth retreat that was being held in town. And it was there that I finally came to understand the significance of what Christ had done for me on the cross. That weekend, something clicked, and I could finally understand that Christ's death on the cross was a once-for-all done deal. In putting my faith in that, in putting my trust in Christ to justify me, I was in fact justified. And from that point on, I needed to walk in the victory that had already been won on that cross. I understood that I was justified by accepting the payment that had been made for me on that cross. I did need to ask for forgiveness for my sins. There was guilt that needed to be paid for. There was a debt that needed to be repaid. And Jesus Christ had done that for me on my behalf. Once I accepted that, I needed to continue to walk in the victory that he won on that cross. I needed to grow in sanctification. And there was definitely a change. There was definitely a shift in my thinking after this. It was hard to overcome some of the things that I had allowed myself to get involved in, such as the types of shows I was watching, the amount that I was watching them. There was definitely multiple times over the next few years where I would just be attempting to push it all away all at once and purge myself of it. And I think that my friends and family had a hard time understanding that at times, but I just really felt like it was something I needed to do. I needed to fast from television, or simply say to myself, we're not going to listen to music at all for this length of time, or what have you. I just needed to step away from it. There was also a shift in my thinking when it came to my desire to respect my parents. I actually wanted to do so now. I wanted to obey them. I wanted to do things and watch things that were pleasing to them, that I knew they would approve of. And unfortunately, this made me a little bit not popular at times going into high school. Again, unfortunately, it would be with my so-called Christian friends that couldn't understand why my parents would ask me to not watch this particular movie or what have you. And I wanted to honor that. That was a problem. And so this was yet another reason why I struggled to maintain friendships in school. Before it was that I was so depressed, I think nobody wanted to be with me really, and now it was I actually wanted to do what was right, and so nobody wanted to be with me. So after graduating high school, I did not know what to do with myself. I had very unrealistic expectations for graduating high school, and suddenly all of those ideas and ideals were simply not there. And so I just ended up going to work. I spent the next 3 years or so working at a little gift shop, coffee shop in town, and really enjoyed my time there. And fortunately, my employer there was also a believer, and so I was able to just freely take off as much time as I needed during the summers to either volunteer at Bible camp or to go on mission trips. So I went to Israel 2 years in a row, or 2 summers in a row. Once in 2012 for 4 weeks and once in 2013 for 3 weeks. It was during that trip in 2012, that first trip to Israel, that I was encountering a lot of young people from the States, and many of them were attending different Bible schools. And in the back of my mind, it's starting to jog something from my high school years, and I'm like, oh yeah, there was this tiny little Bible school that I heard about from so-and-so back in this grade, and I had wanted to go after high school and had just forgotten about it. Just the name completely slipped my mind, and obviously I hadn't ended up going. So all I could remember was the name of the town, I think, was Greenville. Well, if you're from the States, you know how many Greenvilles there are in this country. I have one just like 20 minutes down the road from where I live, here in Wisconsin. And so eventually I did find it. After some Googling and searching, I found it. It's this little Bible school in Greenville, South Carolina. So I sent off an inquiry. This is July of 2012. I sent off an inquiry and like just all excited about finding it and wondering when I can attend. They get back to me and they're like, well, technically it would be too late, but if you would like us to put in a word for you, there's a possibility we could get you in yet this fall. And that's when I all of a sudden was like, wait a second. Maybe I should talk to my parents about this first. So that's what I did. I went home and talked to my parents about it and ended up waiting a full year before going. I do believe that if the Lord had wanted me to and the school had been able to pull all the right strings, that I would have gone that year, but that was not to be. And the Lord spent the next year just really, really preparing my heart for that time at Bible school. There were some things that needed to be taken care of before I went. In particular, the demonic oppression that I spoke of earlier. I do think the Lord had spared my life by stopping me numerous times previously from proceeding with the thoughts of committing suicide. And then he also saved my life spiritually by justifying me and by giving me the tools that I needed and equipping me to walk forward in my sanctification. But now he was going to deliver me from that demonic oppression. So, to try to share very briefly how I understood or realized the demonic oppression that I was under, I was going through a bit of a hard time, having just gotten out of a short relationship that I knew I shouldn't have been in the first place, but it had happened, and now I was left trying to deal with that in my own mind. And I was again struggling with these thoughts that weren't mine. They had dissipated or faded into the background quite a bit over the previous few years, but now here I was in my early 20s and they were starting to come back. And this puzzled me. I guess it also frightened me to some degree as well. And so I spoke to a friend of mine about it and was encouraged to seek help from a particular counselor who specialized in spiritual warfare. I agreed, but decided that I was going to put off making that phone call and making that final decision until after I'd come back from a trip to the city. So during that trip, I was walking by myself from our hotel room to my destination, and I was standing on a street corner waiting for the crosswalk to let me know that I could safely cross the street and continue on my way. I was standing alone on this street corner waiting for the crosswalk sign, seeing cars drive by at definitely high enough speeds that I would have gotten sincerely hurt had I tried to cross too soon. And all of a sudden I feel something like a hand on my back shoving me toward the street. And thankfully I managed to catch myself before I actually tumbled in front of a car that was driving by right then. But I looked around and I was still alone on that street corner. There was nobody else there. And basically that one little event that the Lord allowed is what convinced me that when I got home, I needed to get in touch with this counselor. And long story short, he was able to help me, and he was able to free me from this demonic oppression that had come into my life, as far as we could determine, had come into my life during that time that I became very scared of death, at the time of my mom's transplant, and everything else that had come with it. There were numerous other times in which I had opened doors to other demons to come in, and I had to some extent been starving some of those things out with the actions that I had been taking in just saying no to certain entertainment, saying no to certain actions. Basically just my repentance had already freed me to some degree, but for whatever reason, this particular event needed to take place in order for me to become completely free. So then that fall, the fall of 2013, I moved to Greenville, South Carolina, and remained there for the next 2 years, roughly. And that is where I met my now husband. So when people ask me, when they find out that I'm from Canada, people ask me around here, how did you end up in Wisconsin? I have to go back to the story of how I ended up at a little Bible school in South Carolina. That is where we met, but that is not where we began our relationship. We became acquainted there while he was finishing up his second year and I was beginning my first year of school there, but it wasn't until a couple of years later that we actually full-on began a relationship. And that is a story for another time. That will be, I think, partially included in part 3 of this story of my life. So stay tuned for that. So the next part in this series will be how I found out I had Graves' disease. And then part 3, like I said, will be just basically a recounting of my engagement and wedding story. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, then stay tuned and I will see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.